As ISIL continues to lose territory, has it developed a new deadly counter-attack strategy? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. According to a new report from the independent group IHS, ISIL has lost at least a quarter of its territory in Iraq and Syria in the past 18 months. Put another way, the jihadist group has been forced to give up a combined area the size of Ireland. But even as it faces setbacks on the battlefield, ISIL supporters have taken to social media, encouraging lone wolf attacks in the West. In Nice, France, a truck barreled through a crowd, killing 84 people. In Normandy, 2 attackers burst into a church, slitting the throat of an elderly Catholic priest. In Baghdad, at least 125 people were killed and another 150 injured after a car bomb exploded on a street crowded with shoppers. And in Kabul, suicide bombers killed 81 people in what's been described as perhaps the deadliest attack in the Afghan capital since the civil war started 2 decades ago. In all cases, ISIL has claimed responsibility. Later, we'll talk with Iraq's former ambassador to the United States, but we begin in Kabul with CCTV's Catherine James. And Catherine, bring us up to date on the July 23rd attack. What more can you tell us, and what does the Afghan government plan to do about it?
Right, well, Anand, as you've mentioned, ISIL has claimed a number of attacks in the West, and it claimed this massive attack, one of the biggest we've seen in Afghanistan in 14, 15 years. However, keep in mind that ISIL's plan is to spread terror, and so they are very quick to claim, even if it's an attack as big as this is a big win for them. There is not a consensus that ISIL was behind it, or indeed that they acted alone. This is something that we're still looking into here in Afghanistan. And in terms of what the Afghan government is wanting to do about it, of course, they have been using this as an opportunity to seek more support, more backing, more funds from the international community. How much will be required to contain a group that has shown that it has no boundaries in terms of what it is willing to do? It still remains to be seen just how much it's going to take, given that they have not been able to contain the Taliban. In fact, the Taliban is as strong as ever, despite the international investment we've seen here.
Catherine, as you've pointed out, you are indeed still working on establishing whether ISIL was behind this attack. But is there any indication how big ISIL is in Afghanistan, and in which parts of the country do they pose the biggest threat?
Well, at the moment, the strongest part of ISIL is in the east of Afghanistan. This attack, to some extent, took some security analysts by surprise. They did not believe that ISIL had a foothold as big as this in Kabul, in the capital. However, of course, everyone's taking it very seriously, given that they did claim it. But up until now, the groups that were in the east of Afghanistan claiming to be ISIL were seen more like a franchise, like disaffected Talibs and other insurgents who wanted to break away and form somewhat of a group of their own and use the ISIL franchise, so to speak. How strong the connection is between these groups and the headquarters, if you will, in Iraq or Syria, still has to be established. There's no real consensus on exactly what strength ISIL has here. But as you've mentioned, territory, they seem to be losing territory in Iraq and Syria. So there is some idea that perhaps they will try to establish themselves somewhere else. And obviously Afghanistan is quite unstable and has a weak government and a weak security system at the moment. And so there is a potential that they could try to make a much stronger base here.
Thanks, Catherine. That's CCTV's Catherine James reporting from Kabul. Joining us here in Washington to talk about all this is Ahmad Khaled Majidia. He's a South Asia and Middle East policy analyst. Also with us is Michael Kugelman. He's a senior program associate for South and Southeast Asia at the Wilson International Center for Scholars. And joining us from Beirut is Iraq's former ambassador to the United States, Rend Al-Rahim. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ambassador, let me start with you. We've just seen a spate of attacks by ISIL in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Germany, France. But the group has also been facing defeats on the battlefield in Iraq and Syria. So do you think ISIL has now decided to change tactics, that they will now go after soft targets, civilian targets in those places I've mentioned?
Yes. Well, it's very clear that as ISIS becomes more and more squeezed, particularly in Iraq, but also in Syria, that they need to keep a certain kind of momentum. Remember, they are no longer on the offensive, neither in Iraq nor in Syria. They're on the defensive, they're on the retreat, they're retrenching. They have to show momentum in some direction. If they can't show it on the ground in Iraq and Syria, they need to show it somewhere else, and that somewhere else, unfortunately, is turning out to be Europe and the United States, and of course the horrible events in Afghanistan, the killing of 81 Shia Hazaras. So they are being squeezed, and yet their credibility with their adherents and sympathizers is to show that they are still active, they are still viable. And this is why, in order for them to show their viability, their credibility, they are emerging in other areas. You know, it's a little bit like the Hydra, the nine-headed monster. Once you cut off one head, two emerge. Now, the two that are emerging are not in the same places, not in Iraq and Syria, but they are in other places. Of course, let's not forget, they're also strengthening their presence in Libya and their impact in Libya. They're there in Tunisia, and they also have tried to penetrate into Morocco. So they are trying to find outlets to establish themselves as a continuously viable, credible force.
Michael, let's talk about ISIL in Afghanistan for a moment. You know, our reporter told us that it's very hard to establish this claim that ISIL made, that it was behind the attack that killed at least 80 people. This is not a country where this particular group has been active recently. Has that changed now, do you think?
Yeah, that's definitely something to worry about. For about a year or two, there have been several thousand militants who have rhetorically aligned themselves with ISIS. They're mainly in eastern Afghanistan. But I think the bottom line here is it's important to talk about what exactly ISIS means in Afghanistan and what its presence means. I could say what it's not, first of all. What you do not have in Afghanistan is ISIS sending fighters from Syria and Iraq into Afghanistan to organize and carry out attacks. That's not happening. What you also do not have is local militants in Afghanistan going in great numbers to Syria and Iraq to join the cause there and then returning to Afghanistan and carrying out attacks. You don't have that. What you essentially have in Afghanistan is these essentially disgruntled Taliban, former Taliban militants who have aligned themselves with ISIS. The degree of communication with the central ISIS authorities in the Middle East is unclear, but I think what we saw with this horrific attack on the Hazaras some days ago was a case of these locally based militants who have aligned themselves with ISIS, perhaps involved in the attack in some ways, perhaps with some level of communication with ISIS officials back in the Middle East, but we don't know for sure. But the bottom line is what we're seeing in Afghanistan is very different from what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria.
But these are locals and they've switched allegiance.
Well, I mean, for the most part, we're talking about former Pakistani Taliban members, as well as some former Afghan Taliban members, but it is a local phenomenon.
Okay, Ahmed, Michael raises a great point there when he asks, what does it all mean? What does it all mean? Because we have, you know, ISIL, who's told us in the past that their goal is to create this Islamic State in the Middle East, this caliphate. Is that still their aim, or is it now their aim to just create havoc and mayhem wherever they can?
As the ambassador previously mentioned, the ISIS governing style is fading in Syria and Iraq, and also it's been losing territory. It has lost more than 40% of its territory in Iraq and about more than a quarter of its territory in Syria. So now it has shifted both its tactic and also strategy. We see two trends. One, attack in Western countries. It has told its inspirers and some of its people who support ISIS in the West that it's not time to come now to Syria to find with ISIS against the Syrian government or the Iraqi government, but find the infidels inside West. And on the other hand, it also, now that the pressure is on, both in Iraq and Syria, we see a metastasis of ISIS beyond Iraq and Syria. As we've seen that it has spread its presence in Libya and also in some other northern African countries, all the way to South Asia, and we just talked about Afghanistan. So we see that change of tactics, and as the pressure increases on ISIS inside Iraq and Syria, unfortunately these attacks will intensify in near future.
And I guess what poses the major security challenge in the West, in Western countries, in Europe for instance, is that they're not giving logistical support to these people in these countries, or financial support of any kind, because that could be tracked in some way. They're just saying, do it on our behalf.
The reason that ISIS in Syria and Iraq has found some support beyond the region, all the way to Afghanistan and East Asia even, is that ISIS emerged very quickly, and it was seen as a big triumph, and it had also the it was establishing this Islamic caliphate, or reviving the Islamic caliphate.
Right.
So it was seen as the winner, but that's no longer the case. And as the pressure is increasing on Iraq and Syria, I think that that support will decline.
Ambassador, in early July we had that big attack in Iraq, 125 people killed in Baghdad, 150 people injured, and that happened during the holy month of Ramadan. What kind of impact did that have in Iraq, and what does that tell us about the Iraqi government's ability to provide security for people in the country?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the number that you mentioned, but there were about 324 people killed in the attack, which as I recall was July 3rd in Karada. This was perhaps the single most devastating attack anywhere in Iraq by ISIS, and it targeted a predominantly, though not exclusively, Shia area. Certainly it was seen by the people of Iraq as a whole as an attack on the Shia. And I think that one of your speakers was talking about the tactics that ISIS was using. ISIS has always, certainly in Iraq, used the tactic of attacking the Shia in random fashions, going to areas of Shiism, where the Shia population, and detonating themselves and so on, causing enormous casualties. This is a deliberate attack by ISIS in order to create the type of sectarian conflict that existed in Iraq in 2006, 2007, 2008. And by all Iraqis, it was seen as a deliberate attempt. Now, of course, there is a great deal of desire for revenge, for retaliation. In essence, in my view, there has been a lot of self-control in terms of immediate retaliation of a sectarian kind. In other words, no Shia groups turned around and killed Sunnis in retaliation. However, you're perfectly right. What does it say about the Iraqi government's ability to protect citizens? And the answer is, there's a great disillusionment in all of Iraq about the ability of the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government has really proven itself completely incompetent in protecting civilians. And that is true whether it's in Baghdad, whether in the liberated areas, other areas, even in southern Iraq, which is relatively stable and peaceful.
You know, Michael, as we reported earlier, ISIL appears to have lost something like 25% of the territory it controlled in Iraq and Syria. That's in the past 18 months. How big a setback is that for the group?
Well, it's a considerable setback when you look at what it had not so long ago when it was overseeing these vast areas of territory in Iraq and Syria. And this gets to what we were talking about before, about how this group has to show that it's still relevant and it still has potency by staging attacks elsewhere in the world. And I think the good news is that if we look at a country like Afghanistan, I don't think we have to worry about a group like ISIS taking over territory as it has in Iraq and Syria, and for a number of reasons. The main one being that the climate, the environment in Afghanistan simply is not very receptive to a group like ISIS, just because there are other militant groups that it's dealing with that are much more powerful, like the Taliban. And the important thing to highlight here as well is that the sectarian divisions that ISIS has been able to so expertly exploit in countries like Iraq and elsewhere, they don't really exist its deep level in Afghanistan. Of course, that's what ISIS wants to do. It wants to stoke sectarian violence. But you know, there were massacres of Hazara Shias back during the civil war in Afghanistan in the 1990s. But in recent years, we haven't really seen that kind of violence, which makes me think that it will be very difficult for ISIS to really start doing the types of things in Afghanistan that it did in Iraq and Syria in terms of territorial takeovers.
Okay, I want to get Ahmed's view on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I may just add, while I concur with my colleague that the ISIS has some constraints in Afghanistan compared to Iraq and Syria. First of all, Afghanistan is a non-Arab country. Second, geographically, it's very far away from ISIS core in Syria and Iraq. Right. So sending fighters, sending resources is more difficult. And third, that the Afghan government or the Taliban control almost all territory inside Afghanistan, so there is little vacuum for ISIS to fill in. But the danger is still there. But if the current national unity government in Afghanistan, for example, if that collapses, or if the international community after a year or so stops to support the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces, and that leads to chaos, if there is more fissures within the Taliban movement as a result of the death of their leaders in the past 2-3 years, then that creates a vacuum for ISIS. And ISIS always thrives in lawlessness and vacuums. So that could potentially create some opportunities for some ISIS groups in Afghanistan. And also, as my colleague mentioned, the ISIS in Afghanistan is more a rebranding of some of the militants inside Pakistan, which have moved inside Afghanistan and created a new safe haven. So while we are talking more about the terms ISIS, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, they're kind of same groups. They're just like changing their names. So what's important here is to just targeting the underlying reasons and also the ideology that fosters these groups rather than just going after one group or the other.
Right, indeed. Rebranding, as you put it. We need to take a break right now. More on the continuing threat posed by ISIL when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the ongoing threat posed by ISIL. Let's get back to our panel and let's get to Ambassador Rahim in Beirut. Let's talk about the efforts to counter ISIL. I mean, we've seen the fact that they want to make their presence known around the world. They want to show us that they're still important, that they're still a factor. But if we look at the efforts to counter them, Iraqi security forces recaptured the town of Fallujah from ISIL in June. They've now set their sights on taking back Mosul. And the Iraqi security forces say that they hope to do that, to achieve that, by the end of the year. Do you think that's a realistic goal? Can it be done?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to talk about the city of Mosul. Yes, you're absolutely right. The ISIS has lost Fallujah, they lost Ramadi, they lost Tikrit, and so on. But the really significant city is Mosul. And even though many people have been saying they ought to concentrate on the Anbar province because of the passage to Syria and so on, but Mosul is a powerful symbol of ISIS control and ISIS capability. Never forget that the Islamic State was announced by Baghdadi from a mosque in Mosul. And so Mosul, rather than anywhere else in Iraq or anywhere else in Syria, is in fact the sort of epicenter of where ISIS feels its power, its strength, its prestige lies. This is a very symbolic city. Now, there are many reasons why the battle for Mosul has been delayed and why they went for Ramadi and Fallujah and Tikrit before that. There was the issue of proximity to Baghdad and stopping infiltration from Fallujah into Baghdad. But more than that, you need, Mosul is a city of 1.5 million people. The UNHCR is expecting 1 million IDPs, internally displaced people, to flow out of Mosul when the battle gets started. And the very important element is the political complexity of Mosul after ISIS. In other words, there are many claimants to territories in the larger province, which is called Nineveh. The Kurds claim a certain portion of it, the Christians would like a portion of it, and so on and so forth. So the geography, the political geography of the province is a complicated issue. However, the city itself remains a symbolic issue for ISIS and, of course, for Iraq. So it's going to be a very complicated issue logistically, organizationally, and therefore, in my view, I find it very difficult to see how Mosul, the city, can be liberated by the end of the year. I think it's rather unlikely. They're beginning to eat away at the edges of Mosul. But to actually enter the city and declare victory in the way that they did in Ramadi, in the way they did in Fallujah, is, I think, a long shot for the end of the year.
Right, Michael, if we look at the broader effort to counter ISIL, we look at Libya, for instance, where the group has got something of a foothold. The United States has begun bombing targets, ISIL targets in Libya. Does that signify that the US is going to get involved in a much bigger way in taking on ISIL?
Well, it could well be the case. I mean, I'll state an obvious point, though I think I still need to state it nonetheless, and that's that you know, scaling up military operations against ISIS certainly has its benefits, and it could be very good in the short term, and that it could destroy a lot of these people doing these horrific things. But at the end of the day, I think it would be naive to assume that for the U.S. or anyone else for that matter to step up airstrikes, military offensives, whatever the case may be, against this terrible group. It's not going to make the group go away in the long term. And that's because you have the deeper root issues. I mean, the ideologies that drive groups like ISIS and others, you know, those are not going to go away. So it's complicated to talk about those types of issues, and politically it plays better just to talk about the need to kill as many terrorists as you can, and certainly that's important, but it goes to much deeper issues that certainly extend across, not just the Middle East, not just Iraq, Syria, Libya, but also getting into some of these countries in Europe where you have these radicalized young men. No one really knows exactly what it is that radicalizes them, but they have been radicalized, and they're going to the Middle East to join ISIS. We need to figure out what exactly it is that drives these folks, but it's not something that can be done overnight, and it's not something that's particularly palatable politically to talk about.
Right, it would be very difficult militarily to say, yes, the battle is over, we have defeated ISIL, mission accomplished.
Exactly, it just doesn't work that way.
Ahmed, ISIL in Syria, how strong are they?
They're still very strong, although they have, as I mentioned, they have lost about a quarter of its territory in the past 1 year as a result of the coalition support to some of the groups, but mostly because of the Iranian and Russian involvement there and their support for the Assad regime, as well as the Hezbollah groups from Lebanon. So they have been able to not only prevent the advance of the ISIS, but also just seize some of its territory. But again, similar to Iraq, Syria also, there is just the political environment is very much complex and unstable. And there is also the sectarian divide. On the one hand, we see a Shiite axis of Iran, the Alawites in the government, and Hezbollah fighting a more Sunni insurgency, ISIS, Nusra group, and others. So that sectarian divide, which is played by Iran and Saudi Arabia mainly, but other regional countries are involved too, that will continue to play out. And as long as that environment is there, as long as there is not a regional consensus on the future of Syria, and some of these regional governments reduces their support for some of those groups fighting, I think the problem will exist.
Ambassador, it seems ISIL is not short of any place that it wants to attack. The latest threat is against Russia now, and President Putin, it's made a threat in a video saying that it wants to carry out mass killings in Russia. What's the significance of that? What do you make of that?
Well, I actually am not surprised, and in fact it's been a long time coming. In the same way that that ISIS has hit at France because of France's very vocal and active fight against ISIS, and you know the French have been very upfront and really outspoken about wanting to fight ISIS. So now that the Russians are also doing it in Syria, it's not at all surprising that that ISIS is also threatening. And I would, if I were in Russia, if I were Russian, I would take those threats very seriously. So I'm sure that the Russian government is looking at this. But I want to go back to the issue of ISIS in Syria. And it seems to me that the Syrian situation is so much murkier, because you have ISIS, you have Jabhat al-Nusra, which has just now decided to split off from Al-Qaeda, but God knows what that means. Is this a purely cosmetic act, and so on? In other words, ISIS is the strongest player, but not the only player. And sure, it controls Raqqa and so on and so forth, but the whole geography of the fighting in Syria is much more complex. The other thing is, one of the speakers spoke of a regional consensus. My goodness, we need more than a regional consensus. We need an international consensus on Syria. And it seems to me that ISIS is benefiting from this lack of international consensus, and it is really not at all clear. Yes, everybody says they want to get rid of ISIS, but we're not always clear that everybody is in fact fighting ISIS rather than other actors. And there has been a lot of speculation about who the Russians, certainly in the early days, who the Russians were really targeting, whether it was ISIS or some of the more moderate groups in Syria, whoever they are. And so the whole sort of turbulent and complicated and sort of dark situation in Syria, where you can't see the lines very clearly, has certainly benefited ISIS. It also seems to me that ISIS benefits from the fact that Mosul is not still liberated. And I'm sorry I keep harking back to Mosul, because Mosul is so much the fulcrum, the sort of ideological fulcrum of ISIS. And I would say that if Mosul is eventually liberated, that would weaken ISIS in Syria enormously. It is now clear that many of the fighters who were in Fallujah and Ramadi, and now also on the outskirts in the broader Nineveh province, are in fact retreating to Syria. And we may well get a situation where there's a concentration of ISIS in Syria as they all pull out, and they're sending their families, by the way, and so on. And there are convoys that we can see of retreat. So they will concentrate in Syria, but that doesn't mean that they will be stronger in Syria. There will be a weakened ISIS, a much more vulnerable ISIS. So we have to look at the entire region and not just, Syria in isolation, Iraq in isolation.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.